Good evening. Can everybody hear me at this point?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Excellent, great. So I know you've already been welcomed to Edinburgh by Petros and also by Niels, but I'm going to abuse my position as chair to do so myself, my name is Lucy Grig, and I am the current head of the Department of Classics at the University of Edinburgh. We are very proud of our strength, our growing strength, I should say, in Byzantine studies, and we're delighted to welcome such a wide and international and distinguished group of panelists and audience members. I have to say, I'm also particularly pleased that the festival is making space for study of the late antique West, an area of study dear to my own interests. And this book is one I have been looking forward to for some time. So it's my pleasure to introduce Doug Underwood and his book, Reusing Ruins, Public Buildings in the Cities of the Latin West. I can't see Doug on the screen, but I assume, Doug, you are here, as I have. Oh, there you are. Hello. So I'm just going to introduce Doug now. Apologies, I can hear my children are fighting in the background, so I am sorry about this. It's the authentic Edinburgh working from home experience. So Doug, has a really fascinatingly useful and important job. He teaches classics, including Latin, Greek, and classical studies at a secondary level. His research interests, unsurprisingly, center on late antique urbanism, particularly in the West, with a focus on such elements as fortifications, public buildings, and urban infrastructure. He's currently working on a chapter on late Roman cities in the West for an upcoming Blackwell Companion to Cities in the Greco-Roman World. His book makes, right, I'm sorry, I am going to get these people to be quiet. They are my own children. Okay, I'd like to say that was unusual. So Doug's book, that's what we're here to talk about. It makes a really great and important intervention in this continuing debate around late antique urbanism, and I think this book really is a much needed addition to the field. I've written notes that I'm giving you here, otherwise I might go on a bit long, and that's not the point of this. So it's worth noting, I think, particularly in the context of this Byzantine Book Festival, that when it comes to the late antique West, studies like this have really been lacking. It's a notable contrast to the case of the late antique East, so it's all the more welcome. So the debate on the city in late antiquity, as Doug notes early on in his book, studies of the late antique city have far too often been hampered by a kind of monolithic concept of what is meant by the city. And his approach, which does pay real dividends, is that instead of trying to define what is a city, he starts from his structures. And so cities for him are settlements marked by the key structures or monuments that the book focuses on: baths and aqueducts and spectacle buildings. These are our key categories. And then he looks at these in what we would term the Mediterranean Latin West. Doug himself can tell you what is included. He does include my favorite city, which is Arles. So it is unapologetically an approach focused on buildings rather than people, but nevertheless, this is a book that has much to say about culture and values and how these interact with key economic, political, social, and other forces. Because these structures under consideration, aqueducts and baths on the one hand, spectacle buildings on the other, are so crucially bound up with the cultural values of the Roman Empire and the Roman city that gave them their birth. However, there are many archaeological accounts of such structures. I have read many of them that they prefer not to engage with these larger and more challenging questions. How do the different forces and factors, changes in the economy, in politics, in technology, in culture and religion, how do these interact? And it's really to Doug's credit that he is not afraid to do so. There's even a fantastic flowchart when he shows how these different factors interact. I would love to get my students to produce that kind of thing when I get them to work on topics like this. And So there are many things that are really helpful about Doug's study. Another is it shows the value of a meta study. So we've got a great balance between local detail and broader patterns, reminding us that while we don't want to paint overly broad trajectories, there's no need for the history of the late antique city to dissolve into a sort of fractured and confused picture. Lacking in logic, the nature and the pace of the transformation of the late antique city wasn't purely haphazard. There's a logic to many of these changes, as Doug shows. And as an urban historian, rather than an archaeologist, I really value this, serious historical approach. For my own part, I was particularly happy to find how the discussion of reuse encouraged me to think more, to provoke thoughts about how the inhabitants of the late antique city would have experienced the transitional monuments in their midst. And I was reminded of the persistent but not often enough discussed, the gap. There's a big chronological gap between the point when these structures often stop being used and then are reused. What happens in the gap? How did people experience these monuments? Although, as I've said, it's a book focused on buildings and structures, it does not forget about human agency and experience, something often absent in related works on the monuments of the ancient city. In this way, I think this book is a really insightful account on the urban transformations of late antiquity, and there's much to be found here, even for those who know the material well. But to finish, it's also a work I look very much forward to being able to give to my students. And one particular pleasure of the book is that it is copiously illustrated, often with photographs taken by the author himself. And it makes me feel very wistful for the days when we could go and visit the objects of the research ourselves in person. Of course, I very much hope we will be able to do so again. But in the meantime, I'm going to hand over to Doug now to tell us about the book in his own words. Thanks.
And thank you, Lucy, for those wonderful comments. I am going to try to start a share screen here because I do have a little PowerPoint just to sort of keep myself a bit on track. Is that going to work? Yes, maybe. I think that should be fine. And oops, I've now gone midway through. Of course, there's going to be a technical snafu. There we go. Now I've got to find my script somewhere on one of these various windows that things are floating about. And I think with all this in hand, we can continue. Everyone can hear me okay and everything's working fine. Good. Excellent. I've got a little script here. I'm going to try to stick to time, but Lucy, by all means, if I start to run over, because this isn't the point of me just to talk to you for hours and hours. So if I start to run over, do let me know and we'll trim it there. So this book starts with a letter of Athalaric recorded in Cassiodorus that says, as you see on the screen here, cities are the chief ornament of human society. Let the wild beasts live in the fields and woods. Men ought to draw together into cities. Let the cities return to their old splendor, to stroll through the forum, to go to the baths with one's acquaintances, to indulge in the friendly emulation of the banquet. These are the proper employments of a Roman noble. So there are many interesting aspects of this epistle, like how Athalaric uses the concept of Romanitas and how that is linked to specific urban forms and the activities connected to them. Yet what most interests me about this is the contrast between the old splendor and the implied, but not quite stated, squalor of the present city. Clearly by the 6th century in Italy, and indeed for much of the Roman West, cities had changed significantly, or else there would be no need for them to return to their old splendor. But how exactly had cities changed from their earlier forms? Of course, this isn't a new question. The built environment has long factored into the discussion of the end of the Roman Empire. But an ever-growing body of evidence from excavation and research over the past 20 or so years has brought us to a place where archaeologically led syntheses looking at broad regions can be written. So this book, which started as my doctoral thesis, which I began in late 2010 and submitted in 2014, sets out to use this archaeological data to understand one aspect of these transformations. Now, given the overly large picture of all urban development across the whole of the late antique West, I chose to keep the latter as the sort of study region, but for the former, narrow my focus to look at urban public buildings, those proper adornments of late antique cities, as there were no systematic archaeological studies of these in this region. I should add a brief word about what counts as a public building, not an especially precise term, I realize. I define public buildings of the Roman city as buildings intended for the benefit or use of the entire urban population. So my book concentrates on two major categories of public building in the late antique city, as Lucy noted: structures related to water, baths and aqueducts, and spectacle buildings, theaters, amphitheaters, and circuses. This selection of buildings naturally excludes several other kinds of public buildings, But in this, I was not aiming to tell the story of every public building in every city in the West, but rather to use the selected types to illustrate trends about urban evolution. And I really hope that's not just a convenient way to justify matters of scope that and boundaries that every author faces. I think there was something there. A further note on boundaries before we go on, I set the chronological endpoints of AD 300 and 600. I think the former is a good starting point, as the great majority of the public buildings in the Western Empire relevant for this study, somewhere about 90% or above, were built before the end of the 3rd century. And by the year 600, only a very small number of these buildings were still being used for their original purposes. Therefore, the period of 300 to 600 is an era of significant transformation for Roman public buildings. It's a time after they'd all been built, but before they reached the end of their natural lives. Geographically, it covers the area you can see here, approximately 450 kilometers from the Mediterranean. I'm not going to go into much detail here, but we can talk about that aspect of it if you like in the question period. The main body chapters of the book focus on baths and spectacle buildings respectively and lay out evidence in 4 categories: continued building, maintenance, disuse, and abandonment, in each of the 4 regions covered, that is Italy, Gaul, Spain, and North Africa. As Lucy noted again, I adopted a methodology of a meta-survey, looking at the best available published data. Excavation reports were available, but secondary reports were not, with the aim to establish macro-scale, super-regional patterns for the history of these structures over the period 300 to 600. This allowed for the production of quite a few plans, maps, and something like this for bath spectacle buildings. I've got tons of these throughout, and plenty of graphs as well for those of you that like that sort of thing. And this data is all sort of collected and put together in the appendices as well for the less graphically inclined. A meta-survey like this intrinsically risks a loss of depth in the story being told at the expense of broad trends and developments. This drawback is compensated, I hope, through the addition of 8 case studies, one for each of the regions in the main chapters, which look at the development of individual cities in greater detail, like at Arles, for example, or at Ostia, something like this. Is just some of the images that I use for this case studies. So altogether, this book aims to provide an up-to-date compilation of evidence for several kinds of public buildings and traces their histories in the Western Mediterranean from their main phases to their eventual disuse and reuse. Through the collection of a broad database of evidence for constructions, repairs, and restorations, abandonments, and again, reuses of buildings. This is reuse of bath buildings, for example, which itself will hopefully be useful to others. In addition to my own analyses of this material, the study has explored one key element of the late antique city across a broad geographical range. In the book, this is that flow chart. I aim to show that urban evolution generally, and the history of public buildings specifically, was complicated and nonlinear and influenced by a host of factors, most importantly, a changing pattern of civic finance brought on by the disintegration of the traditional leadership structures and a changing ideology of what constituted a city in the late antique West. It was clear from the data that I collected that cities with imperial connections had longer lasting interactions with public buildings, both by building new ones later and keeping existing ones in use longer. I also think I show several novel trends of urban development in this period, notably that different types of public buildings have distinctly divergent histories, and that regional distinctions are not particularly a useful frame for understanding the history of these urban monuments. I found that some public buildings, like circuses, were built and maintained for longer than others. So this is baths, or we can see here, sorry, I think one of these is a little on the blurry end. I think it's been cut and pasted far too many times. There are circuses down here. It's broken apart by a building there. So circuses remained in use longer than theaters and amphitheaters. This examination also confirms that patterns of reuse were not monolithic either, and the purposes and chronology of reoccupation depended on the type of structure and the needs of the urban populace. So overall, my kind of takeaway on this is that I suggested reifying the city within a singular pattern of decline or transformation. Instead of doing that, we should really continue to move more towards a multifaceted view of urbanism in late antiquity. I think I'll wrap it up there. I think that's right about on time. And I guess turn it back to Lucy.